to us, and I speak on behalf of Tim and Pam also for Pastor Appreciation. You're very, very kind, and we've just been in this thing so long now, I don't even know what to say. Like my wife said, we're just family. We're in this thing, and we're running this race together, and I can't imagine my life without you. You might, from time to time, imagine your life without me, depending on how I get on your nerves sometimes, but I just want you to know it's more good than it is bad with me, I would like to believe, okay? So remember the good. Always make yourself remember the good. All right? Okay. Let's get into something we can really use today, okay? Can I give you something that you can walk out here going, man, I can use that. I can apply that starting right now, this very second. Ready? Okay. Look at this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to pick it up at verse 19. It says, though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. How many of you guys would say you've read this passage many times before? You've heard it preached maybe a little bit. Maybe there's at least a dozen different sermons you could probably pull out of that passage. But I want you to understand this morning the context of that passage. Paul's not being fragmented in his thoughts. He's not saying, I got about a dozen things on my mind, let me just throw it all out there. He's being actually very cohesive with what he's talking about there. He's talking about making himself, training himself, forcing himself to be what he needs to be in life, to reach people, to make life bigger than himself. He's talking about ministry. He's talking about being a witness, a testimony, and he's talking about doing what he has to do to his own body, his own self, in order to be productive in life. He says, I don't run like a man running aimlessly. He said, I beat my very body, which was a Jewish cultural phrase, which had nothing to do with this, but had everything to do with two little words with a hyphen in the middle of it. And the word is self-control. He's saying, I don't run aimlessly. I'm in a race. He said, but just because you're in the race and just because you're running doesn't mean you're going to finish the race and get the prize. He said, you've got to be intentional how you do this. And he's saying, with all of this soul winning and all of this witnessing and all of this ministry and all about making life bigger than just myself, all about being what God wants me to be and running this race and finishing this race where he says, well done, good job, you get the prize. He said, all of this is going to hinge on this one thing, self-control. Self-control. Where we learn how to control self. He said, we will be disqualified for one reason. And he's speaking to the church, by the way. And we're going to bring more context to this in a moment. He's speaking to those who've been in church. They're saved. They've been discipled. They're walking with God. But there's something that could still disqualify them from the things that God has planned for their life. It's lack of self-control. It's all hinging on self-control. I found that self-control tends to be humanity's kryptonite. You know what I'm talking about? We get all the ducks in a row in life, have everything life has to offer that goes in the good column, and just lack this one thing, and suddenly all of our good is being spoken evil of. We can be really good at 99 things, but if we lack self-control, there's like a big spotlight put on that, and suddenly no one takes us serious. And all the good things we're trying to do are ineffective because of self-control, lack of self-control. Paul said that your race and your faith is at the mercies of your self-control. I want you to think about that for a moment. Think about your life in a way that you will not beat yourself up. I don't want you to condemn yourself today. We're past that, I hope. But we're at the point where we need to be able to look in the mirror, become very introspective into our lives, look at all the things that God has built inside of us, and then take an honest look and ask ourselves, what is it that's keeping me from going to the next level? What is it that's keeping me from my race really just shining in life and being effective? And ask yourself, is it the lack of self-control? Self-control. How many has ever heard of the 90-10 principle in life? Anyone ever heard of the 90-10 principle? It's very popular in counseling circles. It goes like this. 90% of everything that happens in life is in your control. Only 10% is not. Now think about that for a second. If only 10% of everything in life is outside of your control and you control 90%, how many of you guys would say, I like those odds? I think I can do something with that. 100% of life is the summation, generally speaking, of a 90-10 principle. 10% made up of things that happen that you can't control. 90% of life decided by how you react to the 10%. 90% of life is a reflection of how you react to the 10%. The 10% we have no control of. Whatever happens is I have no control if the light turns red before I get through it. How I react to it, I completely control. Let me give you a scenario this morning. A scenario that could not only be anybody's life, but if you have children here, it probably has been your life on multiple mornings. And I want to show you how the 10% of what you can't control in life is in fact not what's deciding your life. It's the 90% that you do control. I think of this story because I can relate to this story because this has happened to me multiple times. A family gets up one morning. They've gotten ready for work. They've gotten little Sally ready for school. She's only 6 going on 7. She's not the most coordinated little thing in the world. She's very sensitive in her emotions still. They sat down at the breakfast table and Mama sets her milk down there on the edge of the table for little Sally to drink. Dad's sitting there reading the paper and he's gulping down his breakfast. He's got to get out the door. He's going to be late for work. Little Sally turns and hits her glass of milk, knocks it over on Daddy's shirt, and now Daddy's shirt is ruined. How many of you guys have been in those situations where you realize you can't control a child spilling milk? Been there. Dad reacts. With anger, he reacts. He lets a few choice words fly as he scolds his 6-year-old daughter. Because she's very sensitive, and that's Daddy talking to her, she bursts out in tears, and her heart is broken. As she begins to cry, Dad now turns to Mom, who's still in the kitchen, and said, you should have known better. You should know not to put this child's milk right there. You should have known she was going to spill it. And a conversation ensues. It's not necessarily very productive first thing in the morning between a husband and a wife. The wife is running late for work. She storms out the door and she says, you're going to have to get her to school because she's missed her bus. He runs upstairs to change his shirt, put a clean shirt on. He comes down ready to go. But little Sally is still sitting at the table crying because she's so brokenhearted because Daddy's mad at her. He says, come on, get in the car. We've got to go. And they go flying out the door and they get in the car. He's got to take her to school. He doesn't usually take her to school. He's going to be late enough as it is. So he's driving 40 in a 30-mile-per-hour zone, and he gets pulled over, and he gets a $60 ticket. Now he's even 20 minutes later. They get to school. He opens the door. Little Sally gets out. There's no goodbye kiss. She gets out the door, and she closes it, and she walks off. And she doesn't do what my daughter does to me at least 3 times every day when I let her out of school. She doesn't turn around to wave goodbye. Dad storms off to work. He gets there, he's late. He busts through the door. His boss gives him a dirty look. He runs to his office and he realizes he was in such a hurry that he forgot his briefcase. Bad just went to worse. Can't get anything done at work today because everything he needed to work on is in his briefcase. He leaves work that evening, he goes home. He walks into his house where his wife is at, and his daughter is already home from school. He walks into his house, into a very cold environment where the air is still very edgy from what happened in the morning. Dad's had a bad day. The wife has had a bad day. Little Sally's had a bad day. It's been a shroud on everything that has happened through the course of the day. If we take this story and begin to tear it down, we have to find blame now. We have to find fault. Whose fault is it that Dad was late? Whose fault is it that Dad got a ticket on the way to work? And whose fault is it that Mom and Dad are not happy with each other and they're arguing now? And whose fault is it that little Sally's brokenhearted and now she's a little skittish around Dad? And what caused it? Is this the fault of the glass of milk? Is that who we look at and say, well, it was the glass of milk? If she wouldn't have knocked it over, if Mom wouldn't have put it there, if I wouldn't have forgot my briefcase, if I wouldn't have been running late, if I wouldn't have got that ticket. Is the events of this day decided by the 10% that could not be controlled, or by the 90% that could be controlled? Imagine now a similar scenario where the family sits down for breakfast and Mom sets the milk there, and maybe she's just assuming little Sally's going to pick it up and move it over. I know that there's at least 10 times in every meal that I pick Hannah's glass up and I move it over towards the middle of the table. I don't know why kids like to set it on the very edge. Somehow it probably has something to do with the fact that their arms are only this long, would be my guess. And we're sitting there going, what's wrong with you, child? Are you insane? Do you not know how to move this? And they're actually putting their cup in proximity to their mouth, the same as us, only our arms set the cup there and their arm sets the cup here. The 10% that can't be controlled happens, and little Sally knocks the milk over on Dad's shirt. Suddenly you can see the fear in her eyes. What does this mean? This is not good. Dad calmly, gently looks at little Sally and says, Sally, baby, you need to be more careful. Okay? Be more careful from now, okay? But it's okay, but be more careful. Little Sally doesn't burst out in tears. Dad runs upstairs. He changes his shirt. He notices his briefcase there because he's not in such a huff. He picks it up. He comes down the steps. Little Sally's on the bus. Mom's to work and he's to work. And they come back home and they're having a great day. Psychologists say that on average 90% of our life is decided by how we react to the 10% that can't be controlled. The red lights that happen at the wrong time. I can't control that, but I can control what comes out of my mouth when it turns red. I can control the emotions that begin to spew. I can resist honking my horn when there's nothing anybody can do about it. I can control me. Self-control. Self-control. You control 90% of your life simply by how you react. There's a man in the Bible that learned this lesson, and he learned it the hard way. He didn't have someone evidently stand up on a Sunday morning and say, let me help you make your life a little bit better today. Let me talk to you about self-control. He learned it the hard way, and his name was Peter. And funny enough, though Paul speaks much about self-control, nobody talks about self-control more than Peter. The man who very clearly, when we read the stories of his life, at one time at least had no clue what that terminology meant. He's a man that's always reacting. When there's a scenario and he doesn't have the faith to do something, and he's all out of sorts, and he's all battling about who's the favorite, and he's always getting upset about something. Peter can't control his emotions, and Peter can't control his mouth. No clearer picture is there than in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the guards come to take Jesus away. And Jesus has been abundantly clear what needed to happen here, but they did not have ears to hear it. Ironically enough, a man who did not have an ear to hear what was being said to him pulls out a sword, slices off one of the temple guard's ear, a man named Malchus. Jesus says, "Put the sword away, Peter. Put it away. Control yourself, Peter." Because of Peter's lack of self-control, Jesus had already prophetically told him, you know you're going to deny me here in just a few hours, right? "No, Lord, not I." "Lord, what do you see in the future that I don't see?" And Jesus would probably say, "Well, it's not that I see so much in the future. It's just I've been kind of watching your life the last 2 or 3 years. I see you don't have a great deal of self-control. And I know if there's anybody here that ain't going to stand up well with what's about to happen in the next few hours, it's probably going to be you, because you don't have a whole lot of self-control." Sure enough, before the rooster crows in the morning, Peter has done denied Jesus 3 times. He can't control his emotions. He can't control his fear. And he would write about self-control. I love this passage. And on the way down to here this morning, it's one of those mornings where, you wake up an hour early because of the time change. And funny enough, in 16 years, this is the first Sunday I can remember that we didn't get to church and somebody was sitting out in the parking lot wondering where everybody was at. It's the first time I can ever remember that. But we got up early, and Hannah and I left the house early this morning at like 8 o'clock, and it was a little before 8 actually, and I'm looking at the Hummer clock, and it's like almost 9 o'clock, and I'm going, "Oh my goodness, I'm going to be late for sound check. They're going to treat me like Tim today." Tim Oliver, that is. "Tim, where are you at?" "Oh yeah, Christine, could you do me a favor? Could you get that boy out of bed a little bit earlier on Sunday morning?" That, you know what? Thank you for your honesty. Yeah, we noticed he wasn't late till he got married. I was just giving you an opportunity to confess your sins today, so good job. Good job. Your sins are removed. Go and sin no more. So I took Hannah through Burger King drive-thru, and on the way down there, she had her Bible, and she said, she was looking through it, and she said, She said, "Daddy, I think I'll be reading the New Testament this morning." And I said, "Well, baby, that's good. In fact, I'd rather you just stay in the New Testament for a few years." And she said, "Well, okay." She didn't even ask why. She said, "Okay." She said, "Daddy, I have a verse of Scripture I want to read you today." And I said, "Okay, baby, what is it?" And she read this passage here found in 2 Peter 1. It says, "For this very reason, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love. For if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from being ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ." Isn't that exactly what Paul said? He said, "I'm in the race." He said, "But just because you're in the race doesn't mean you're going to finish and get the prize." He was talking about being unproductive and ineffective in life. He said, if I don't add self-control to my faith, to my relationship with God, my knowledge of God and His kingdom, I will be ineffective in life. Peter, speaking from experience, says the same thing. Look at 1 Peter 4:7. "The end of all things is near. Therefore, be clear-minded and self-controlled so that you can pray." Solomon said that a man who has no self-control is like a city whose walls and gates have been torn down. Now that's one of those colloquial things that we can try to read a whole lot into it, but here more than likely is what that colloquial phrase is saying. If you take a city, back in those days, in that culture, a city was defined by its walls and its gates. Here is our city. How do we know that's our city? Well, do you see our walls and our gates? This is our city. This is our territory. This is us. This is who we are. A man with no self-control, he said, is like a city, though, who doesn't have walls or gates. And what he's saying is, there's no way to define who that man really is. He can say that he believes this. He can say that he knows that. He can say that he's good at these things here. But if he has no self-control, there's really not a true identity to that man, because we're not really sure we know him. I was flipping around last night and forced myself to continue watching college football despite what happened yesterday and what is happening this season. I love college football despite what happens to the Mountaineers. It's just better when the Mountaineers are good. So I was watching the game of the century, and with LSU and Alabama. But I'm flipping around, and while I'm flipping around, because you get a little bit bored, and yes, I go past the channel that I wish nobody would ever watch. Especially if you're married and you want to see your husband through a good filter, not a negative one. The Lifetime channel. Where all women are victims and all men are dogs. And, but this movie caught my attention when it was coming on. I saw the tag at the bottom when I was flipping around. It said The Preacher's Wife. Has anybody seen that by any chance? Based on the true story of a Church of Christ preacher a few years ago. It's like, I need to see what's going on with this preacher's wife. It might give me some insights into my own. I didn't know what the story's about, but then when I found out what it's about, I was very interested in it because I love stories based on true life. And of course, who knows besides God and that woman what was really going on? But if the woman was as honest as she appeared to be, and if we would buy into what the jury did, which I would have no reason to challenge that, it would definitely sound like that pastor had a dual identity. He was one thing in the pulpit, and he was one thing to the people. They thought he was the greatest thing since cotton candy, but when he went home to his wife, he was a completely different person. And he was a man who had no self-control. He cussed her, he beat on her, he almost smothered the children many times when they were babies, crying because it got on his nerves. A man who knew how to put on a face in public, but when he stepped out of the public spotlight, the real him came out. And so that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. You know this person from here, but then you begin to find out about it here. And the people in the church, their attitude. I remember when the story happened, they were interviewing all kinds of people from the church as these stories began to come out. And they were saying what most of us would say in that situation. It's like, man, did we even really know that guy? He appeared to have his act together, but now we're finding out behind the scenes, man, he's just a mean old cuss. He's abusing his family. The dude's just a heathen. I mean, who is that guy really? That's what Solomon's talking about. And that's why Peter's saying, it starts with faith, but at some point, if you don't learn to add self-control to your faith isn't going to really be developed in anything effective and productive in life. I shared the story about my dad on the back of the bulletin today, and isn't it funny how certain stories just brand in your mind, just little simple things that most people say, well, why do you remember that? Well, they would just have to be in your shoes, I guess, to be able to understand. But I'll never forget that day that we're trying to get the cows in the corral, and it's time for the autumn vaccinations, and we get them almost up there, and a couple cows break free, and they run through this fence, and now they've busted through, and they're back out in the field again, and it's hard to round up. I don't know if you ever tried to round up like 70, 80 head of cattle at one time and get them in a corral. It's not easy. And we had dogs that helped us, but usually you try to get a pack going and everyone stays with the pack. But there's a couple wild cows, man, that's got a mind of their own. And we had them in there. We had them. And once two of them break free, getting those two back in there, is going to be so difficult compared to getting the whole herd in. And those cows broke free, and I just remember my dad pulling off his cap and just throwing it down on the ground and then just staring at that cap for a few minutes. And then he picked it back up, put it on, and said, all right, boys, let's go back and get them. It stands out because I never saw my dad react so violently before. Because my dad was very laid back. And as a child, I would always try to balance what I knew of my dad from the stories that my mom used to tell about how she'd have to go down to the bars every Friday and Saturday night and pull my dad out of the bars because he was destroying everything. He was a brawler. He was a fighter. And when he gave his life to Jesus Christ, it began to have huge, huge effect on him. He was kind of like Paul. I mean, he had a true conversion experience. A lot of people respond to altar calls and say sinner's prayers, and 10 years later, they're still basically who they are, struggling with the same old stuff. My dad wasn't like that. My dad had a true conversion experience. And it developed into a great walk of faith for my dad. Many of you here knew my dad very well. And we will, as a church family, we will never forget the impact that he had on us as a church family. A great man of faith, very humble. Cool, calm, and collected. I'm telling you, you can bust the man right in the teeth with the hammer, and he just looks at you and says, "Son, it'll be okay." If you've been around to hear some of those stories. And so when my dad took his cap off and threw it on the ground, it's like, oh my goodness, what's about to happen here? That really stood out, even though most people would not have even noticed that. My dad, though, as I've thought about it through the years, he's been gone over 4 years now, and as I've reflected more on his life, it's not his faith that made him stand out in the crowd. We noticed him and noticed his faith, but we only noticed it because of his self-control. He was who he was. In public, in private, the man was just gentle. He was humble. If something extreme happened, he did not freak out. He did not lose his temper. He did not cuss. He did not rant. He did not rave. I'm not saying that, humanly speaking, there's not moments where that is understandable. I'm saying that the man got our attention, and he will go down in our history book as one of the greatest men that most of us knew, but it wasn't his faith that got our attention. It was his self-control. But because his self-control verified his faith, we saw his faith was a great faith. A man with no self-control, a human being with no self-control, is like a city with no gates and no walls. There's no definition there. Who is this really? The Bible is full of people that God used despite their lack of self-control. That's the good news. The bad news is they never, hardly ever finished their race the way that God designed. Guys like David, who goes down in history as one of the great ones, battled self-control. Battled self-control. Looks out the window, sees Bathsheba taking a bath. He's been walking with God. He's a worshiper. And instead of operating in self-control and not looking at that, looking away, he looks and he looks and he looks. And out of his lack of self-control comes an adulterous affair. And out of his lack of self-control comes the murder of an innocent man. All because of lack of self-control. David battled his whole life. He's walking with God and he's been victorious. He's a king among kings. He's considered the king of kings in Israel. And he gets into a situation where he's not sure who's for him and who's against him anymore. And he begins to number the fighting men. He sends messengers out from village to village and says, ask them one question. Are you for the king or are you against the king? And God got irate because God wanted him to understand, if I'm for you, who can be against you? Stop trying to find your strength in humanity. I am for you. And he got upset. Somebody get the blowtorch and find that telephone. And there was a price that was paid, and there was many people who lost their life through disease because of David's lack of self-control. Because David had no self-control, it was in the DNA of his own family, as his sons didn't even have self-control. He didn't have a single son that on some level did not demonstrate great lack of self-control. From a son who's literally raping his sister, to a son that's trying to steal his throne, to a son that when he becomes king cannot control himself with the ladies and loses the whole kingdom because of it. Moses was a man who battled self-control. He battled his emotions. when the people would get him stirred up and the people would get him angry, he would open his mouth and he would say things that he should not say. Things that was changing God's whole destiny for his life. Elijah was a man who battled self-control of his emotions and self-control of his mouth. After God did great victories in his life, Elijah can't control his emotions and he has a pity party. He falls into that woe is me because he can't take the truths of God and embrace them in his life. He can't seemingly control his own emotions and his own lips. For guys like Moses and David and Elijah, their race did not end the way that God would have wanted it to end. We all grow up teaching our kids self-control. How many of you guys are intentionally keep teaching your kids self-control? Remember when you were a kid and your parents were trying to teach you self-control? How many of you all had parents that said, you just got to hold your breath and count to 10? How about count to 10 and you can breathe while you're doing it? Some kind of combination. No one, am I the only one here, along with the millions of other Americans, who it was just traditional growing up as a kid that when you get angry, somebody would say, count to 10 or count to 100. How many knows what I'm talking about? Or I'll put you all to sleep today. What are we doing? We're trying to teach our children self-control. It's like, count to 10, count to 100. Put it out of your mind. Don't think about it. Take a deep breath. Walk away. We're trying to teach our children self-control because we understand that when they become adults, if they don't have self-control, their life does not hold much of a destiny. I like the way that this lady taught her child self-control when it came to throwing temper tantrums. I'm willing to try that next time you're at Walmart and the kid throws a fit. Already done it. But a story of a man who was at the grocery store, and in front of him was a young mother with a small toddler in the basket in the buggy. They were going down the candy aisle, and the toddler began to scream out for candy. She wanted candy, and she was making it known to everybody in the store. But very gently, he heard the mother say, "It's okay, Ellen. We're almost out of this aisle. We'll be out of this aisle in a little bit and the temptation will be gone. Hold on, Ellen." He follows her down the next aisle, which is full of potato chips, and the little girl starts throwing another tantrum. She wants potato chips. She wants potato chips. And she hears the mama very gently saying, "It's okay, Ellen. I'm almost done here. We're getting ready to go to the checkouts and we'll be out of here. It's okay." She checks out, she goes out into the parking lot, and the man follows her out and he says, "Excuse me, ma'am, I just want to tell you, I'm just very, very impressed by how cool, calm, and collected you were with little Ellen while you were in the grocery store." She said, "Little Ellen?" She said, "I'm Ellen. This is my daughter, Tammy." You do what you got to do to maintain self-control. You talk to yourself, you talk yourself down, you find your happy place, you do whatever you got to do, because if you have lack of self-control, it will negate your faith, and your good could be spoken evil of, and your race could end without you winning the prize. You could in fact be disqualified as Elijah was, as Moses was, and as David was, deep into their race. And God disqualified them and raised up another to do their job. Even as we teach our children self-control, we've got to teach ourselves that. I tell Hannah often, and I'm having to do it less and less, thank God, as she's getting older. But especially when she was 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, she's never been a crier. We're not sure if that goes back to the orphanage where the babies, it didn't do any good to cry because no one picked them up, but she's just never been a crier. But that don't mean she ain't been a whiner. And when she would want something, she would want it, and she'd start whining, and she'd just pitch a little tizzy. And I would just say to her, very calmly usually, "Now, baby, Are you going to control yourself? Or do you need Daddy to help you? And there were times that she could not control herself. And Daddy had to help her. If you're a good parent, that's what you do. Not to the extreme that the judge did with the viral video going around. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We do what we have to do to teach our children self-control, because we understand everything in their future will be hinging on this one thing, maybe more than anything else. Peter said, you're going to have to add to your faith self-control, or it will become ineffective. We've got to learn that when something stirs us up emotionally, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong when our emotions get stirred. It doesn't mean that we don't get upset because we're running late and every single light is turning red. It doesn't mean that we're happy when baby spills the milk on us. It doesn't mean that we just look at that and go, oh, it's just all good. No, it's reality that things stir us up. I'm not talking about that. But we've got to learn to do what the Bible says and add self-control to our faith. We've got to learn how to counterattack our emotions and diffuse situations instead of using our own emotions and our own words to throw gas on the fire. Jesus called that type of person a peacemaker. And Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will what? They will inherit what? The earth. If they become peacemakers, if they learn to operate in self-control, learn how to diffuse situations, he's saying what Peter said and what Paul said. They'll become effective in life. They'll inherit some things. They're going to be fruitful. Self-control is a common topic in the Bible. It's one of those topics that gets overlooked because it doesn't seem all that spiritual. And yet the writers of the Bible make it very clear that unless you can add this to your life, all that super spiritual stuff may not produce a whole lot. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they'll be called the sons of God. I thought about this several years ago, and in connection with God. Because we're made in His image, and however God is, that's how we are. And God has made it clear that we've been given all power for life and for godliness. Whatever we need, the power is already there, right? Isn't that what the Bible says? All power has been given to us for life and for godliness. Power to be fruitful, power to be effective, power to find your purpose, your destiny in life. It's all been given to us. We're made in the image of God. All power belongs to Him, and He's given power to us to create and produce just like He did. But I got to thinking about God one day, and I don't know where these thoughts came from. I was at a conference, they were preaching on the power of God. And they were talking about how God had the power to do this, and God had the power to do that, and nobody was arguing with that. God's got the power to do whatever He wants. And somewhere this fleeting thought came to my mind. God's greatest power is His ability to control His own power. God's greatest attribute was not the power to create the universe, to create humanity, to keep it all in check, to be sovereignly in charge of everything that's going on. God's greatest power is His power of self-control. And I got to thinking about that with all of God's great mercy, His grace, His forgiveness of sins, His restoration power, His blessings, all the wonderful attributes of God, if we take just that one thing out of the equation, God's lack of self-control, suddenly the whole thing self-destructs. Imagine that you've got the power to do anything that you want, but you control yourself and you don't. Does it not appear to you that there were a few stories early on in creation, especially, where God may have had a few fleeting thoughts to just kind of sneeze on the thing and blow it away? I regret that I ever made these human beings. It happens twice early in creation. People can't get their act together, and God's like, this is not what I was planning. And God's like, I regret that I ever made them. I mean, what does it take to send a flood and drown everybody? And yet, even within that, there was self-control because He saved the righteous. God's greatest attribute is His ability to control His own self, His own power, His own nature. That has been passed on to us now. is one of the greatest commodities we could ever have. So here's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about everything going on in your life that goes in the bad column. Where you say, man, my marriage stinks, my kids stink, my job stinks, my relationships stink, everything I'm doing stinks, I got things that stink inside my heart, things that I'm doing that I know is wrong, it's destructive, and I keep doing these things. It could be an addiction, it could be pornography. All these things that I'm doing, and I know that it's coming back as a very negative thing in my life. I want you to stop and think about that for a second. And I want you to ask yourself this honest question: how much of that is in your control to change? I have the answer for you. 90%. 90% of everything going on in your life, even in the bad columns, you say, I hate this, and man, I'm emotional about this, and I'm reacting to this, and I'm saying this, and I'm doing that, and 90% is in your control. 90%. And let me tell you the way it really works. I know we've tried this in the 20th century church. I'm just telling you, it doesn't work. We can't give an altar call today and say, how many of you guys want self-control in your life? Come up here, because we're going to lay hands on you, and God's going to impart a beautiful gift of self-control in your life. There's a reason it's called self-control and not God control. I'm telling you that no matter what the good things are going on in your life, if you don't add self-control to it, it will negate the good. How many of you guys that are battling things in your marriage would admit that if you would just operate within that 90%, your marriage would probably start turning around within hours? Let's just be honest. Let's be honest. We can't control our mouths. We can't control our emotions. We think it, so we say it. Right, Corey? Where's Corey? And they're making all those seasoned saints upset yesterday about their canes and walkers. I'm picking on Corey. If Corey really was in sin, I wouldn't reveal it to the whole congregation. Dale, I would, but not Corey. Self-control. Self-control starts with desire. It starts first really with a revelation, understanding, wait a minute, I just had a revelation today. There's a whole bunch of stinky stuff going on in my life, and I've been upset about it because I can't control it, and I just realized today something I don't think I wanted to understand. I am controlling it. How many of you guys wish you wouldn't have came to church today? Because you really wish you didn't know this. It's easier to blame someone else. It's easier to assume, well, there's nothing I can do about it. No, there's a whole lot you can do about it. I've learned through 28 years of marriage that there's a whole lot of things my wife does that doesn't exactly thrill me. Not as much as what does thrill me, by the way. Just to be clear about that. Yeah, I made it almost to the end, Terry. That 2% carnal guy I still got in there. I'm like 2% milk. Listen, I am not perfected in this area at all. I'm just very aware of it. And I'm really trying to learn, especially the last 2 years. I don't know if my wife has noticed it that much or not, but the last couple years especially, I've really tried to operate more in an area of self-control and not just spouting off. Just saying, well, blah, 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 blah. And then the rest of the day, there's a coldness between her and I. And now this is affecting this, and it's affecting that. Now I don't know what she's put in my supper. No one needs to live like that. I've got enough to worry about with what she puts in my supper when she's not mad. See? I'm sorry, I couldn't pass it up. I just couldn't pass it up. I would have kicked myself the rest of the day if I'd have passed that up. I'm willing to even face the doghouse over that, and that was a good one. Self-control. All right. So what were we talking about? You see what I'm saying? Chip, I'm not right. I'm not perfected, but I am suddenly very aware of how far I've got to go on this journey. If you are aware of it for your own life today, and you're ready to say, but quite honestly, I am really ready to step into a new level of self-elevation, to begin to operate in the self-control that Paul told me I needed to operate in. And Peter said, please add self-control to your faith. I'm ready to step into a new level, so I want you to stand with me. There's strength in numbers.